everyone, I'm Kayla, and welcome back to my little corner of the criminal content YouTube channel. This is part 2 of our 2-part series on Thierry Tilly, a con man who turned 3 generations of a French aristocratic family into a cult. Just as a refresher, here are the 11 people in this family who are involved in the cult. Guillemette, the matriarch, who was 88 when this started. Guillemette's son, Philippe, 63, who is a Shell Oil executive. His girlfriend, Brigitte Martin. Guillemette's other son, Charles-Henri, who was 53. He was a gynecologist. And his wife, Christine. Charles-Henri and Christine's 3 children, Guillaume, Amory, and Diane. Guillemette's daughter, Ghislaine, who was 55, and when this all started, she ran a secretarial school in Paris. And then her husband, Charles-Henri. Guillemette, the matriarch's daughter, Ghislaine, who was 55 when it started, and she ran a secretarial school in Paris. And her husband, Jean Marchand, and then their 2 children, Guillemette and Francois. So we left the family in 2003. They were sequestered in their chateau by Thierry, who was in England and controlling them remotely. And Jean Marchand was doing everything he could from the outside to save the family. At the end of 2003, Francois and Amory were sent to Oxford, presumably for their schooling, and there was money sent to Thierry every month for their school, but obviously that money was not going to their school, and they were actually holed up in a tiny apartment. Thierry told them that none of their family members were calling them because nobody loved them anymore, and he made them do really strange things just to keep them on edge. From 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, he told them to sit across the street from a building and survey it and write down in detail every little thing that happened. Then Guillemette was sent to live with them, and they all had to share a tiny apartment with no heat, no hot water, and no money. They all had to take retail jobs, and they sent 90% of their income to Thierry. So fast forward to August 2006. Thierry still has his claws deep in the Vidrine family. And Thierry invites Christine and Charles-Henri to Oxford so they could all talk about the progress of fighting against their enemies. And Thierry set them up in this little house across the street from where he was living that was under construction, and they ended up staying there for 3 years. And it was at this time that Thierry told Christine a secret about herself that she didn't know. Thierry told Christine that somewhere deep in her subconscious was the knowledge of the whereabouts of a secret treasure. Apparently, Christine and her family were part of a long line of ancient families from France who had been chosen by kings to be guardians of a treasure, and that the families passed down something called the transmission from generation to generation. Christine's family had a considerable amount of money, and all Christine had to do was unlock the transmission in her brain to learn the location of that money. And Thierry was like, don't worry if you can't remember it right now. You probably forgot it because the burden was too much to bear for you. That happens a lot. And Christine was like, this is totally bananas. But she went along with it because she was afraid if she didn't, she was going to be alienated by her family. So Thierry told Christine's family to interrogate her. And eventually it got so rough and exhausting that Christine just told them a story about a coming out ball in Belgium. And Thierry was like, that's it. The treasure must be in Belgium. So he sent Christine and Guillaume to Belgium, where they had to go from bank to bank asking for accounts or security deposit boxes with her name on them. And obviously they didn't find anything, and they returned home empty-handed. When they returned home with nothing, Thierry convinced their family that Christine was hiding information out of greed. In January of 2008, Thierry took Philippe, Ghislaine, Christine, and Charles-Henri to his house in Oxford. And he was like, one of you knows the location of this treasure, and you are not to eat, sleep, or leave this room until you figure out who. So they really intensely interrogated each other until they just like as a group decided that Christine was the one who knew where the treasure was, and they locked her in the basement. Thierry told Charles Henri that because Christine had gone through hypnosis before, if she fell asleep while she was in a state of distress, she would wake up insane, and Charles Henri then became terrified to let Christine fall asleep. They left her in the basement, sitting on a stool, facing a wall. They continued to interrogate her and deny her sleep, and they also would not let her go to the bathroom or eat anything. This got so bad that Christine eventually started to believe that she did have the location of the treasure somewhere in her subconscious, and at one point she became so desperate that she just like spouted out a string of numbers and the name of a random bank. These obviously led nowhere, and Thierry was so enraged that he became violent. He also turned her family against her by telling them that Christine had had an affair with Jean Marchand, which they believed instantly, and they also turned violent and they screamed at her to confess. The interrogation remained violent and abusive for 24 days until they were all too exhausted to continue. Thierry told them that because they hadn't been able to recover the location of the treasure, they now had to sell their chateau in order to pay for Thierry to continue to protect them. And somehow they were all lucid enough to refuse. So Thierry compromised and convinced them instead to take out a mortgage on the house. The house ended up selling for 460,000 euro with the stipulation that they could buy the house back if they paid 51,000 euros annually. The money from the sale obviously went to Thierry, but what he did was he had it transferred to Guillaume's account and then to his own account so that it would look like Guillaume was the one who was defrauding the family. In February 2008, Thierry had a meeting with the family in which he broke down how he paid his teams to protect the family, and Philippe, something cracked in him and he was like, "You're a fraud and a liar." So Ghislaine and Charles Henri immediately came to Thierry's defense. And then Thierry looked at Philippe and was like, "He has a knife in his pocket." And Philippe was like, "I don't have a knife in my pocket." And he showed them that he didn't have a knife, but the family was so far gone that they just believed that he had a knife. And then there was a whole physical confrontation between Philippe and Francois and Diane, and Thierry was able to break it up, but the damage was done. On February 5th, Philippe, Bridget, and Ghislaine went back to Philippe's house, and something in him snapped and he attacked Bridget, and he was yelling that everybody was blind. And then when he finally snapped out of it and realized that he had been physically assaulting his wife, he called the police and had himself taken to a psychiatric ward where he ended up staying for 2 weeks. Philippe's estranged daughter called Jean Marchand and told him what had happened to her dad, and Jean Marchand reached out to Philippe and they finally met up. They met up in Paris and they ended up spending a week together. Jean Marchand was able to convince Philippe to take legal action against Thierry Tilly, and Philippe also gave Jean Marchand the address of where his family was staying. So Jean Marchand went to go visit his family, and they still believed that he was part of the Masonic plot against them, and they immediately turned him away. Then Jean Marchand tried to visit Guillemette, who had been sequestered by Thierry in Bristol. In Bristol, she had finally broken away from the cult mentality, and she had gotten a job at an Italian restaurant and fallen in love with the owner, whose name was Giuseppe. When Jean Marchand went to visit her at the restaurant, he was told that she wasn't there. And then it turns out that Guillemette had told everybody at the restaurant that if her dad ever showed up to tell them that she wasn't there. Guillemette and Giuseppe actually ended up getting married in 2009. So all this time, Guillaume had been working as Thierry's personal assistant, and Thierry had been convincing his family that Guillaume was a traitor. If we remember, he had the money from the sale of the chateau transferred into Guillaume's account before transferring it to his own account, so it looked like Guillaume was the one defrauding the family. In October 2008, Thierry kicked Guillaume out of his house, and the entire family turned against him and took legal action against him. By February 2009, Thierry had relocated Charles-Henri and Christine to an apartment in Oxford, and they had found jobs. Charles-Henri became a gardener, and Christine got a job at a little cheese shop. Obviously, they gave 90% of their income to Thierry to pay for their protection. The owner of the cheese shop, Robert Puget, was like so confused by Christine. He was like, why is this woman who like acts and speaks like an aristocrat working in a tiny cheese shop? And so he tried to get Christine's story out of her, and she was really reluctant to talk to him because she believed that Robert was an agent working with Thierry to test her. And then one day Thierry showed up at the cheese shop and like tried to get Robert to enter in some shady business deal with him. And Robert was like, Christine, what the fuck is going on? You have to tell me. Christine finally cracked and told Robert everything, and he encouraged her to call her friend Marie-Helene, who actually had been working from the outside for 9 years to rescue Christine from the cult. And the two of them met up in Oxford, and Marie took Christine back to France with her. In France, Christine met with Daniel Picotin, a lawyer and cult specialist who had been working with Jean Marchand, and he took her to court where she told her whole story to a judge. The judge immediately charged Thierry with abuse of weakness, sequestration aggravated by acts of cruelty, abuse of weakness, and fraud. The British authorities did not want to help, partly because abuse of weakness was not unlawful in England. However, the French authorities learned via a wiretap that Thierry was planning to flee to Switzerland, so they released his passport and papers back to him in the hopes that he would then travel to Switzerland, and he did. In October of 2009, he traveled to Switzerland where he was arrested in Zurich. He was taken back to France. He was charged and indicted. 7 members of the family were still under his control, and they believed that this was just a cover-up. Meanwhile, an exfiltration team was set up. The team consisted of Daniel Picotin. They had a criminologist. They had a psychoanalyst. They had Jean Marchand, Christine, Philippe, Bridget, and a journalist. The exfiltration team prepped for 9 months, and they went to Oxford in November 2009 to enact their plan. There ended up being 2 missions. The first one failed spectacularly. On December 12th, 2009, they launched their second exfiltration mission. A cult specialist posed as a magistrate's emissary and went to Ghislaine and read a transcript of all the shitty stuff Thierry had said about the family when he was indicted. And Ghislaine, upon hearing this, suddenly became overwhelmed by the extent of Thierry's lies and snapped out of it. Thierry's trial began on September 24th of 2012, and on the stand, of course, he said a bunch of bananas things. He said the Vadrines had acted willingly. He said actually he had lost money trying to help them. He called them a gang of resentful, greedy, provincial aristocrats. He said that he was the king of Israel. He said that he was the heir of Napoleon III. He said that he had at one time been a hostage of the Freemasons. He said that he was a general. He said that he could speak 8 languages. He said that he was the richest man in France and that he founded Greenpeace. And in a brutal move, his father testified and was like, yeah, none of that is true. Among the family members who testified were Christine, who talked about her months of abusive imprisonment, and Henri, who talked about how he had actually been locked in a tiny office that Thierry claimed belonged to the Blue Light Foundation for 7 months. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Thierry was sentenced to 8 years in prison out of the 10 maximum years. Jacques Gonzalez, the president of the Blue Light Foundation, who existed and had been getting a bunch of money, and Thierry said that he was like the puppet master of the whole organization, ended up getting 4 years for being Thierry's accomplice. Thierry then appealed to the court of Bordeaux, who ended up increasing his sentence to the maximum of 10 years. Thierry spent his time in prison writing letters of conspiracy theories against him to judges and courts. And once he had served his time, he was sent immediately to a psychiatric ward where he remains to this day. A financial investigation estimated that the Vadrines had lost a total of 4.5 million euros to Thierry Tilly. The family has only recovered 200,000 of those euros, and they were never able to get their chateau back. And that is the story of Thierry Tilly, the con man who turned 3 generations of an aristocratic family into a cult. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe so you can get notified when my next video comes out, and I'll see you next time. Bye.